Let's protect the distinction between our faith and our government.
The founders, when they talked about separation of church and state, it wasn't barring God from the public square.
So what did they mean? Most of us are for separation of church and state, but how far should government and religion be separated?
I don't believe in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute.
Absolute. It certainly isn't now. In some towns, the Ten Commandments are posted conspicuously in front of courthouses. Is that wrong? What about "In God We Trust" being all over our currency? David Silverman, president of the American Atheist, says both are wrong. But Harry Mihet of the Liberty Council says it's a myth that the Constitution even requires separation of church and state. Really? I thought it did.
Absolutely, John. The words separation of church and state are nowhere to be found in our Constitution. The fact of the matter is that our founders were by and large men of great faith who were neither ashamed nor afraid to acknowledge that our rights come not from man, not from government, but from Almighty God, the Creator God. And the first thing that our founders did after they enacted the First Amendment was not to enact some kind of absolute separation of church and state, but rather it was to establish a chaplaincy in the U.S. Congress and to hire not one but two chaplains to start every session with prayer acknowledging this God.
David, it's not in the Constitution. Where did this separation idea come from?
The phrase separation of church and state doesn't have to be in the Constitution. It is, however, civil law. And when we're talking about the separation of church and state, what we're talking
What
about...
do you mean it's civil law? It has to come
It's civil
from
law.
somewhere.
The United States Supreme Court interprets the Constitution. They came out with the separation of church and state. And it is civil law. It is just as strong as the Constitution.
They invented it out of thin air, essentially.
Well, not totally thin air. There was this Treaty of Tripoli in 1796.
Yeah, you know what? The Treaty of Tripoli is the smoking gun that says I win. It was signed on order of George Washington, signed by John Adams, ratified unanimously.
Says the government of the United States is not in any sense
founded in the Christian religion. Black and white, smoking gun, I win, you lose.
You can revise history all you want to. The fact of the matter is that our founders were not afraid to acknowledge God, and they did that in our founding documents. The Declaration of Independence says that we are endowed by the Creator with unalienable rights.
The founding fathers were
They weren't afraid
diverse.
to acknowledge God, and they did. And
they acknowledged God.
Yeah, and throughout our history, our nation has always been a nation that blessed God.
Well, Lincoln and Jefferson were not religious, so it's not all.
And neither was Thomas Paine. Patrick Henry was. The founding fathers were diverse. What they did, they got together, Christians and all the rest of them, got together and put together a secular constitution that's
all history. Let's talk today. I could see, Harry, that he, as an atheist, going into a courthouse with a big cross or the Ten Commandments, would think, boy, this court isn't going to be fair to me.
He would be absolutely wrong. There are over 53 expressions of the Ten Commandments on our nation's highest court, in the Supreme Court.
I am surprised to see "In God We Trust" on all the currency. This is not something the founders did. It started to appear in the time of the Civil War. It appeared on coins. Didn't appear on the dollar bills until I was 10 years old.
Look,
this is politicians monkeying around.
Well, our founders acknowledged God in our very foundational document, the Declaration of Independence.
It's different from putting it on every coin.
Patrick Henry, who was brought up, said that when a people forgets God, tyrants forge their chains. I've lived in a nation where God was forgotten.
You're from Romania.
I grew up in communist Romania, and I experienced the chains that the tyrants forged because they forgot. They refused to acknowledge that our rights come from God. They said our rights come from man or from government, in which case the government can take them away from you.
Communist totalitarians, God or not, they would have been bad news.
Once you take God and morals out of the equation, the sky is the limit, my friend.
Once you take God out of the equation, everybody is free to make their own decisions, okay? This country, we can debate the history all we want. The question is, do we want a nation that picks and chooses who gets more rights than others, or do we want a nation of equals? My opponent here does not want a nation separation of
You
equals.
atheists are obnoxious, objecting to these crosses, which are harmless, or the Ten Commandments, getting in everybody's face.
They're not harmless.
Your rights aren't being threatened.
Every step away from the separation of church and state is a step away from religious freedom, a step away from religious equality, and a step toward theocracy. And yes, it does harm us.
For example, how? Where? Far?
When you're an American citizen and the money says that you're a second-class citizen, it harms you. When the Pledge of Allegiance is told to your kids and they have to pray to a God, they have to acknowledge a God every day against your wishes, that harms you just as much
Harry,
as it would
what
harm
about
Harry.
that?
It is not coercive nor oppressive for an atheist to allow his fellow man to express their public belief in God. That's just common sense. That's just good manners.
Why should churches have a tax deduction?
Aha.
Churches, like all 501c3s, whether religious or not, provide an important service to the public.
Churches don't even have to turn in the IRS forms.
Well, you want separation of church and state. Certainly you don't want government
I
to
just see
decide.
all these giant churches sitting empty 6 days a week,
Paying no property taxes,
Look, the United
and not
Way-
filing their forms. Billions of dollars, billions and billions of dollars goes into the church, and we can't
The United Way provides
figure out how
a
much it is.
valuable service to the public, so do churches. But if you have the
That's
government
fair.
reviewing the forms of the churches, deciding which churches have proper beliefs and not, that's not
It's not
separation
about
of
proper
church and
beliefs.
state.
Your group has to file different forms.
We have to file forms. Churches don't. We have to file 990s every year. If you want to go to the government, we have to report our income every year. We have to report how we're spending our money every year. We have to defend our nonprofit status every year. Churches don't because they're churches. That's religious
sounds like
discrimination.
government favoring
Yes, it is.
No, that's not true at all. They don't, because government shall make no law respecting an establishment
It's
of
not
religion.
establishing of religion. You recognize the IRS tax code differentiates between secular and church and religious
What
organizations.
I recognize, David, is that you made this exact claim in a federal lawsuit, and
You're
lost
avoiding my question.
flat out.
All right,
we're out of time here. Thank you.
You're avoiding the question.
Thank you, Harry. David, coming up, the surprising result when government neglected religion turned out to be good news for religious people.